Holland 44, a game about Market Garden and a game by Mark Simonich. Definitely a veteran designer, somebody who has designed more than one game about World War II. And, well, these are just some of his games. And this stack here includes one of my favorite war games of all time, which is Ardennes 44. In Holland 44, Simonich lends its expertise and talent to a topic which is tricky Market Garden because of the configuration of the terrain, because the map, as you can see here, necessarily must have an unusual shape, very wide, not very tall, because of the technical complexity of the topic, because of the difficulty of representing land operations and of course paratroopers, because that's of course is in the essence of the theme. When you're representing Normandy, the Normandy landings, usually you resolve the paradrops in the first turn, and then you're sort of like done. And there may be of course an extra sequence in the first turn or two when you're representing the landings themselves, but then you're done. Here there is an interaction between the land and the sky that of course you need to represent if you want to have a game about Market Garden, not something else, but of course it just represents an extra challenge for the design. So Mark Simonich, seeing what he has done in the past, I had very good hopes that he'd be able to give us a strong game about this topic. But before I talk about that, before I present you my conclusions, why don't we go in order and let you have a closer look at the game first. The map for the game is pretty large. It is printed on paper, and it is actually two maps, a larger map here and a smaller map that you place overlapping the main one, just to represent this big stretch of land where the allies are trying to take control of key positions. In fact, at the beginning of the game, you will have some allies units coming from here and trying to push their way through, and of course it ain't Market Garden without the paratroopers. And then you have other areas here on the side of the map where you will place a paratrooper belonging to the ally player, and they will try again to cut lines of communication and to clear a path to the incoming units. The game has instant victory conditions for both sides, but if neither player manages to achieve those, then victory is based on victory points. The ally player scores victory points for controlling city axes on the map. Some axes are more valuable than others, and also the ally player scores points for having units on the side of the lower Rhine, but those units need to be non-airborne units and able to trace a supply path to a supply source. They can't just be sitting there. So you need to demonstrate that you have been able to really take control of the map and to create supply lines. For the German player, it's all about the slaughter. The German player scores victory points by destroying enemy units, and of course a big source of advantage in terms of points is preventing the ally player from taking control of locations, although that does not give the German player victory points per se. Units are divided in infantry units, which have a NATO symbol on their counter, and armor, which has a silhouette. Some units, some German units are concealed at the beginning of the game, and they will be revealed later as the ally player engages them. The three numbers that you see printed at the bottom of the counters represent attack strength, defense strength, and movement values. Artillery doesn't have a number there, but an indication that that is a support unit. Armor also has a small number there next to the attack value, and that is the armor rating, the quality of the armor. The number that you see here, like 3 or 1 in this case here, is the number of steps when a unit takes a hit. It is flipped to the other side if it is at full strength, and now we're reminded the unit only has 2 more steps. If it had 3 and loses 1, also there is the band there that tells you it is reduced. If the unit that has 2 steps takes another hit, it is not eliminated, but it is removed and replaced by a counter with a single step. So there is that. that element that you see in some games of units that are of counters that are double-sided, that are using sets to represent units that have more than 2 steps. Also, some units have a background of a white or red color behind the defense, and that indicates the morale. The morale can be a lit if the background of the defense value is red, can be low quality if the background is white, and that of course may result in modifiers. Terrain is very important. As you can see, terrain is a mess. There are all sorts of things here, from marsh, polder, forests, some roads here and there, but then they lead to bridges, and those bridges, since it's market garden, will receive a lot of attention. If the bridge symbol between 2 hexes doesn't have any counter on it, then the bridge is operational. Bridges may be destroyed, and of course the German player will try to destroy them. And when that occurs, you place a marker there. Maybe a bridge is under repair, and in this case you place this marker here to indicate that the bridge is being repaired. And there are several other rules about how you blow up bridges and you repair them. Of course, it takes time to repair those bridges, and it is in the interest of the ally player to repair blown up bridges as soon as possible. The game has a lot of small rules, units that behave in specific ways, rules again to handle all that may happen to the bridges, breakdown units, which means that large units can be broken down into smaller units, which is not only an extra set of rules that you need to learn, but also increases the logistical complexity of the game, because you may have to record which broken down units belong to which units in case you want to reform them later. You have rules for the weather, rules for recovery, for air landing, again, because you have units that enter the board through air landing. So you might, when you read the rules the first time, feel a little bit overwhelmed, but remember this: in truth, the overall structure of the turn is very simple, because you check the weather, then the ally player takes his turn, then the German player takes his turn. You check to see if a player has met instant victory conditions, and then you repeat. So with all the small things that may make you lose sight of the forest, you need to remember there is a forest there, not just trees. And the forest is organized thanks to this very simple turn structure. Allies goes, and the German player goes. Now, during a player turn, first a player will resupply their artillery, and artillery may fire during combat, and in which case you flip it to this side, and then during the artillery supply phase at the beginning of a player's turn, you resupply the artillery that fired. You check bridges, that is, a German player may try to destroy bridges. During an ally player, then there may be air landing, and then we get to finally the standard stuff: movement and combat. Movement, you move spending your movement value, you move your units. Terrain will affect movement in all sorts of ways. Also, zones of control, very important here. When you enter a zone of control, and enemy units project zones of control in the hexes surrounding them. When you enter zone of control, you have to stop, you spend extra movement points to enter zone of control, you spend extra movement points to exit a zone of control. Also, this game has a typical Simonicism, that is something that I see in designs by Mark Simonich, but I don't think I've seen it in designs by other designers. That is, not only do you have zones of control, but also you have enemy bonds. That is, if 2 enemy units are exactly 1 hex from one another, they project a bond in the space between them. And if the space between them is, like in this case, an X side, then you have to imagine that now there is an unbreakable force barrier that will stop enemy units. So even if you spend extra movement points to leave a zone of control, you cannot leave a zone of control moving through an hex bond in this case. And again, actually, the bond may occupy an entire hex in case the 2 enemy units that have an X in between are facing an X side. That is, there are X sides in between, and so there is a full hex, not just an exit in between. So enemy units may make hexes impassable or hexes impassable depending on where they are. Since the German player is on the defensive, this is very important. You need to play with those bonds to slow down the enemy as much as possible. And this is the only, I would say, unusual thing that you have about movement here, these bonds. But if you play other games by Simonich, you should be familiar with them at that point. It is also during movement that you can merge units, create breakdown units, you reveal unknown units that may be on the map at the beginning of the game, this sort of thing. Then, actually, it is also during this phase here that the German player may attempt demolition of bridges that are wired for demolition. There is a set of rules on how bridges get wired, may lose their wire status, may regain it. You'll have fun reading about all those. Combat, that is what everybody wants to know. Combat is very simple, almost classic in a sense, because you have a combat table with the time-revered odds ratio system. That is, you will put together the attack strength of the attacker and compare it to the defense strength of the defender, turn that into a ratio such as 1:1, 2:1, 1:2. That gives you the column, or I should say the initial column, because modifiers are expressed in the form of shifts to the column, to the right or to the left. To the left, of course, is in the advantage of the defender. To the right, it's to the advantage of the attacker. Armor sheet, the attacker gets shifts to the right if the attacker has an advantage in armor, that is if the attacker has armor and the defender doesn't, or if the attacker has better armor than the defender. If you have unsupported tank units, that is they're not supported by infantry, then the defender has a disadvantage and then the attacker gets that bonus. Morale shift, that is elite units of the attacker will make things easier for the attacker and give the attacker a modifier. Air support and artillery support, again, we saw air support, there is a special procedure for that, and we saw artillery. You simply flip the artillery counter when an artillery unit is landing support. Of course, artillery units also have a range value, and that is, you need to take that into account. You cannot exceed the range. Other modifiers, and of course part of the fun is precisely this, or to say a big element, of course, is setting up attacks or preventing attacks, depending on which side you're playing, and you're trying to prevent the opponent from getting too many bonuses, and as the attacker, trying to get as many bonuses as possible. So the defender really doesn't have many favorable shifts, but the defender can try to deny some of these. And however, you may attack mainly with one formation. Units are divided in formations that are color coded. You may attach a unit from another formation to an attack, but if the unit is not part of the lead formation, which is again the main force of the attack, then the strength of that one is halved. And then terrain, again, terrain being a big element of the design, that also will affect things. Again, it seems like a lot of stuff to go through, but it all makes sense thematically. It all makes sense if you've seen other war games, especially war games by Simonich, for example. The armor thing is another thing that you find in many games by Simonich. Once you have the modifier, that is final column, you roll a die and cross-reference the column with the result of the die roll. And the result may be that the defender is shattered, so there is a step loss and also a mandatory retreat. Then you have a series of results for the defender that include the retreat, but not strictly mandatory. Like in other games by Simonich, the defender that achieves one of those, that suffers one of those results, may choose to try to avoid retreat in case there's a position which is really important. And again, in games by Simonich, very often position is important. Market garden is key, of course, taking control of certain locations or defending certain locations. Then the defender may choose a determined defense. The column, then a die will need to be rolled with modifiers that will apply. The column will depend on the terrain because being successful in a determined defense attempt changes, has better or worse odds depending on the terrain. Then you roll the die. You cross-reference. If you see a dot there, then the defending units manages to hold the position, but then there are extra losses that need to be taken. The number to the left of the slash is the number of extra losses that are taken by the attacker. As you can see, that rarely happens in a determined defense. Much more commonly, the defender will take an extra loss. The number to the right of the slash is the number of step losses that the defender loses in an attempt to a determined defense. And then you have other results such as exchange, engage, no advance, no retreat, and no step loss, but you place an engage marker there, and that will provide modifiers later, like in this case here. And then, of course, there are the stuff that may apply to the attacker. After the combat phase, you have the recovery phase, where all friendly, disrupted, and retreated units that are not adjacent to an enemy units recover 1 level of organization. And then you have the supply phase. You need to check for supply to avoid negative effects. During the German player's turn, the German player may place traffic markers. That's always a little bit of an abstract thing. It does represent, of course, problems that the ally player has to face. I don't know, the German player would be able to control where exactly the allies get stuck in traffic jams, and how and where they will be slowed down during their movement in their turn, but so be it. It's just a way of simulating an extra challenge for the ally player. So summarizing again, don't be scared by all of the sub-rules and exceptions. Check the weather, ally player turn, German player turn. During each turn, artillery supply, stuff happens to the bridges, movement, combat, recovery, supply. And you're good. This is the core, this is the heart of the game. Holland 44, this is a strong design. I really like it. I can already tell you that. Maybe not a game that is really appropriate for novices, for new wargamers, unless you're a new wargamer and you're a patient person and you decide to teach the game to yourself. Then you take as much time as you want. You reread the rules as many times as needed. There's also an extended example of play which really does a good job of explaining the concepts, but to me the challenge is not really that there are any difficult concepts in the game. In a certain sense, there is a very classic feel to it. Look at the combat table. That's like old school, glorious old school combat table based on odds, on a ratio. Rather, the point is not, again, that there are difficult concepts to grasp. Everything is very classic. Every rule and mechanic that is in the game, I've seen it somewhere else before, which is not a problem at all. It's just that of these classic rules, classic concepts, there's a lot of them. There really is a collection of all of these ideas, breaking down units, there's also control, special units that do something specific in certain circumstances, blow up the bridge, rebuild it, prepare for blowing up, blow up something else, etc., etc., etc. A lot of small details that surround this, otherwise very simple, very classic, very linear core of rules, which is pretty much I go, you go, move and attack. What's more standard wargaming than that? So if you're a new wargamer, don't be worried about that. If you decide to embrace this game, again, probably the only unusual thing is the zone of control bond. But if you have played other games like Simonich, you've seen that even. Just sit down, relax, keep in mind when you feel lost that at the end it is I move, I attack, you move, you attack, with a couple of interactions as the opponent moves, but mainly is very simple. And just, keep the rulebook there and reread as necessary, and then you'll be able to play the game. What also makes the game manageable, although you have a little bit of an extra challenge when it comes to the rules, is the fact that the number of units on the board is not too large. It's very manageable. You won't lose sight what's happening. Also, the units will tend to be in clusters as you're trying, especially to part drop them as close to one another as possible, to be able to trace lines of supply to the part dropping areas as you are moving on one side of the board. And the Germans, yes, are scrambling around a little bit, trying to figure out what the bottlenecks are, where the opponent is concentrating forces, and therefore trying to, well, to concentrate defenses there. You cannot attack the entire front as the Allies with the forces that are advancing by land. You cannot attack the whole front, not just because you may not have enough units to create a strong line, but simply because you do not have bridges everywhere. You have to concentrate on places where bridges are there, or where your engineers are going to build bridges. And there's a mechanic there that is particularly smart, I find, that that allows the ally player to sort of like delay building bridges or committing engineers so that the German player doesn't know until pretty much the last minute or exactly where the engineers of the Allies players are going to build the bridge. You can get a sense. You can get a sense of where that might be, but you do not know exactly when. If you could see in advance, I place engineers there as the ally player, then the German player places all the forces right in front of those engineers on the other side of the river. That would make the game really dull. But there's a little bit of uncertainty there. Which I find to be very smart. So you have to make decisions. You have to decide as the ally player where you're going to concentrate your advances and your attacks, and therefore, seen from the other perspective, as a German player, you have to exploit the fact that the ally player may find himself stuck into bottlenecks, and so you're again about concentrating forces. Those decisions are all very interesting. Those are very interesting choices from the point of view of gameplay. Also, what is really interesting is I almost feel like you're struggling against the terrain, you're struggling against the map almost as much as you're struggling against the opponent. And again, the fact that you do not have too many units to worry about, it's a very manageable count of units, allows you not to lose sight of this constant struggle between man and marsh, man, and other types of really impeding, really hard to negotiate terrain. In a sense, it reminded me also of Ardennes 44, again, a game that I like very much. Here in Ardennes 44, you do not have nearly as much water. The problem is those darn trees. And here you have a different patchwork, a different sort of like leopard skin that you have to deal with spots of annoying, prohibitive terrain, with again bottlenecks that you're trying to create to exploit, or you're trying to prevent the opponent from exploiting. The terrain is tough, and to me is really what gives flavor to the design. On top of that, you have the fact that that the action happens in different areas of the board. It's not like you will not feel that there are parts of the map that are underused, because between the paratroopers in one area and the front advancing or trying to advance in the other area, you're going to have a lot of interesting synergies there, with the German player, again, scrambling around, trying to reinforce everywhere and trying not to find his force in the middle of the map sandwiched between different groups. So really you have the focus of attention that shifts from one area to the other. The whole experience feels very organic, and that's great. That's absolutely great. And again, this could potentially make the game feel chaotic and confusing if you had more units. I think that here the designer found a way of abstracting forces in pretty much just the right number of units. It doesn't feel like one of those victory point games that are just introductory games about. There are several of them which are fun, but very small, very linear, very basic. It is not a monster game like the one that MMP published about Market Garden. It's just right. You have a number of units and a range of capabilities here that allows you to have fun with a lot of gameplay options, with a lot of challenges that you had to face, of problems that you had to digest, of very organic interactions between the two sides and the sides with the board. You have all of those things that do not feel overwhelming, do not feel too complicated, do not give you a brain burn. They just challenge you enough to keep you entertained and to allow you to develop fun strategies, again, without ending up in chaos and confusion. For all of these reasons, I can tell you that Holland 44 is a very strong design. Really fun to play, not the easiest game out there, not exactly an introductory game, while at the same time not being really hardcore, somewhat of an intermediate level. If it's for a novice, then it will be a challenging game for a novice. If it is for a seasoned war gamer, especially someone who is familiar with designs by Simonich, you will still have to memorize a couple of things that apply to this theme specifically. That unit does that and the group does that. But other than that, I don't think you will have any particular problem getting started with the game and moving from mechanical implementations of rules to actual gameplay, to actually having fun with the rules and the units and the action that will take place on the board. In general, Holland 44, another very strong, very fine, very fun design by Mark Simonich.